So, for this week, we're going to cover our chapter on federalism. Now, federalism it's kind of a confusing point of our government, but it's not that bad. Essentially, federalism are kind of the rules that dictate the relationship between the federal government and the state government. So, we touched on this a little bit last week about the 14th Amendment and how it makes the laws of the federal government supreme to those of the state. So, first, we'll kind of look at the way different systems of government work. So, a unitary system is where there is one sovereign power at the top that controls everything for all people. Now, a unitary system would be like a monarchy, would be like a dictatorship. This is where all the authority belongs to a single person or a single family, a situation like that. Like today, that would be like North Korea, somewhere like that. Um, Now, confederal system. This is what the Confederacy was, and this is what the Articles of Confederation established in the United States prior to the Constitution. In a confederal system, each state is sovereign and it delegates power to the central government for specific purposes. But most power is maintained by the states. If you haven't had U.S. government yet, you will talk about this. This was our first attempt at government in the United States. Was a confederal system. It did not work, and so we drafted the Constitution and created a federal system. But the Confederacy, the southern states, also used this system during the Civil War. In this system, the states have the power; they have the most say so about what happens within their borders. Now, the federal system is not something that really existed prior to the United States drafting its Constitution. We essentially created a whole new form of government, and that is the federal system. And this is where power is shared between the federal government and the states. But the Supremacy Clause, which is Article 4, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution, states that federal law is superior and supreme to the law of the states. That the state constitutions and judicial systems and things like that cannot create laws that are not authorized by the United States government. So, a good example here. If you remember back in 2015, we had Obergefell versus Hodges, which was the Supreme Court case that legalized gay marriage. Prior to that Supreme Court case, we had a situation where gay marriage was legal in some states, gay marriage was not legal in other states, and we were approaching a point where it was almost half and half of the states. And so the Constitution of the United States does not like this kind of situation. In the Constitution, it says that all citizens are entitled to all rights in the entire United States. So when we have a situation like this where the states don't agree with each other, the federal government has to step in and settle that issue. And so in 2015, in the case Obergefell versus Hodges, the Supreme Court ruled that the United States could not make gay marriage illegal based on a lot of different legal principles and things like that. And so once the Supreme Court made that decision, that became the law of the United States. So the states could no longer outlaw gay marriage because it had been legalized at the federal level. And we've been through this with a lot of different things throughout our history. Now, Texas, Texas, almost more than any other state in the country, clashes with the federal government over the Supremacy Clause. Texas does not like being told what to do by the federal government. Texas has, throughout the past like 40 to 50 years, has been a very conservative state. And conservatives tend to like this idea of state rights, where states know what is best for them within their borders, and that states should have the ultimate say so about how, what goes on within a state. But that's not how the federal system works. And so oftentimes when we get a ruling or a law that Texas doesn't agree with, it will still try and push back against that. Some notable issues: gay marriage is one. Um, the abortion is another. The Voting Rights Act, things like that. And we'll talk about these kind of as we go through the semester about areas where Texas has clashed with the federal government. But even when the federal government makes a law, Texas typically will try and sue the federal government. We're doing this right now over the Affordable Care Act. Texas does not like the Affordable Care Act and the mandates that were put forth in it, so it is currently suing the federal government to try and overturn that. If that doesn't happen before the election, and if Joe Biden happens to be elected president, that probably won't go forward. If President Trump wins re-election, there's a good chance that it could. But that's a good example of Texas opposing the federal government. Now, looking at the United States Constitution, there's a couple of things here that kind of dictate its relationship with the states. There is a part of the Constitution called the enumerated powers. This is Article 1, Section 8. And these are the powers that are given directly to the federal government by the Constitution. The state cannot get involved in these issues. This is things like the power to coin money, so we all have the same currency. If we go back and look under the Articles of Confederation, each state had its own currency. And so if you had your money in currency from Massachusetts and you went to New York, you couldn't spend your currency. You had to convert it to their currency. Under the federal system, the entire country uses the same form of currency. The federal government has the power to collect taxes. Now, this is because under the Articles of Confederation, there were different uprisings and threats to the government, but in the Articles, they did not authorize the federal government to collect taxes, and so it could not pay for an army. So the country was essentially left defenseless, and each state had to kind of raise and pay for its own state militia. And so when we drafted the Constitution, we then gave the federal government the power to collect taxes so that they could provide for the common defense, which is the next one. We look to the federal government to protect our country. They are the ones that maintain our military, protect our borders, all that kind of stuff. So taxes go hand in hand with that responsibility. The federal government registers patents and protects people's ideas and maintains the military. So those are all powers that belong to the federal government. The state does not get involved in those. Now, where the states and the federal government clash are the implied powers. The implied powers are not stated in the Constitution, but Section 8 says Congress shall have the power to make laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers and all other powers vested by this Constitution. So, what does that say? We refer to that as the necessary and proper clause. But essentially, what that says in plain language is that any power the Congress needs to assume to make sure that those enumerated powers work, they can do that within reason. So, let's look at collecting taxes. The federal government, the Congress, does not have the time to collect our taxes. So what they did is they created an agency. They created the IRS, which is probably the most hated agency in government. But the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, they are the agency that is responsible for collecting our taxes. Now, the IRS is not mentioned in the Constitution, but under the implied powers, Section 8 gives Congress the power to create laws if they're necessary and proper for carrying out their duties. So they create an agency like the IRS to help them collect taxes, or they create the Federal Reserve to coin our currency, things like that. Now, the states will start to clash with the federal government when they feel that they're taking the implied powers too far. if they're trying to assume powers that they are not given expressly, if they're trying to, get involved in state affairs, things that states have authority over, that's typically when they clash with one another. And then we have the Commerce Clause, which gives the federal government the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among several states and with the Indian tribes. That is the actual wording from the Constitution. So, what this means is that, let's say that you start a business in Texas, and let's say you start I don't know, let's say you start an insurance company in Texas, and you only sell insurance to people in Texas. Under that system, Texas is the authority that will regulate your business. So they have the power to enforce regulations, tax you, and things like that. And we know that Texas is a very business friendly state. So, taxes are light, regulation is light, things like that. Now, let's say that you expand your insurance company and you start selling insurance to people in Louisiana, Arkansas, Oklahoma, all the surrounding states. Now your business has become interstate. Once you cross state borders, now the federal government has the power to regulate your business. So any business that crosses state lines or is with foreign countries, the federal government has the authority to regulate those businesses. So that's what the Commerce Clause does. So make sure you know on this one, make sure you know the enumerated powers and the implied powers and the differences there, because I definitely will ask you about those. Equal Protection Clause. So this is what we talked about last chapter, the 14th Amendment, when all of the southern states were readmitted to the United States. They had to recognize that slavery had been abolished. But when we had to write that second Constitution during Reconstruction, the 1869, all the southern states had to ratify the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment essentially takes all the laws of the federal government and says that they apply to the states as well, and that the citizens of every state must be treated equally. So this goes along with that idea, like we were talking about with gay marriage. The Constitution does not like a situation where citizens have different rights in different states. It should be the same across the board. So the 14th Amendment is typically the one that is invoked when we're making an argument about things like civil rights, equal rights, things like that. So if we look at what's happening in our country today, another situation that is approaching kind of the same circumstances is the legalization of marijuana. If you look at that, we have, we're up to close to 20 states that have legalized either medicinal or recreational marijuana. The Constitution doesn't really like this situation where we have different laws in different states. And so, is it a question of equal rights? Well, you can definitely make that argument because we do know now that marijuana provides relief for certain medical conditions. Whether it is people who are fighting cancer, it helps their pain, it helps their appetite. People with glaucoma, people with anxiety and depression. We know that cannabis helps these conditions. So you could make an argument that if you have these medical conditions and you live in the state of Texas, you are being denied access to a medicine that you could get if you lived in Colorado or California or something like that. Also, if we look at some of the states that have legalized marijuana, they are also going into their criminal justice system and freeing people from prison and wiping their criminal records of low-level marijuana offenses. So if you're in jail in Texas for a low-level marijuana offense, you could make the argument that people who are incarcerated in these states are getting access to something that you do not have access to. So I wouldn't be surprised in the next few years, especially if I would say if Joe Biden wins the presidency, this is probably something he's more willing to entertain than Donald Trump. But we could see a case over marijuana legalization at the Supreme Court. It'd be interesting to see what the outcome would be. Um, Due process. When we talk about due process, we're talking about the Bill of Rights and all the protections we have when it comes to contact with law enforcement and the judicial system. And we'll talk more about this in our criminal justice chapter. Um, but the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment together ensure that states must treat citizens equally under the law and follow certain procedures. So when you are arrested, you have the right to remain silent, the right to an attorney. If you can't afford one, one will be appointed to you. You have the right to a jury of your peers. All that kind of stuff gets expanded to all the states through the 14th Amendment. So the 14th Amendment is probably one of the most important and powerful amendments. So make sure you know what it does. The reserved powers, the 10th Amendment says any power that was not given to the federal government is reserved for the states and the people. And we call that the reserve clause. And so these are the things that typically are under the authority of the state. And so when the federal government tries to get involved in these things, the states, especially Texas, will typically have a problem with it. These are things like education, public health, the way we conduct our elections, safety, welfare, and morals, which we typically interpret as safety, criminal justice, keeping people safe. Welfare, we typically define as welfare services, although it is a shared responsibility with the federal government. Morality is the tough one. So, morality is left within the authority of the states, but we don't always agree on whose morality. If we look at the state of Texas, and we're talking about morality, then we are typically talking about traditional Christian morality. But the Constitution, the United States Constitution, protects us from having to practice someone else's religion, from there being a national religion declared, and things like that. So when it comes to morals, there's often a lot of conflict within the states. And so, you could imagine, like you look at an issue like abortion. Abortion is a religious issue for most people because they base their pro-life beliefs on their religion. But you have people who do not practice that religion who are pro-choice. And so that's a good example of trying to legislate morality and the types of complications you can get from something like that. We'll talk about that more as we go on this semester as well. Concurrent powers are ones that are held by both levels of government. And the best example here is taxes. Taxes will be collected from you until the day you die, unfortunately. And you will pay taxes to the federal government. We pay our taxes to the federal government through our income tax. And then you will pay state taxes, such as sales tax, property tax, school taxes, all that kind of stuff. So those are concurrent powers because both levels of government can exercise that power. And then finally, full faith and credit. Full faith and credit, Article 4, Section 1, requires the states to respect the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. So what this means, full faith and credit. Before the Constitution, if you were let's say you were in Massachusetts and you entered into a contract with someone in New York, and one of you broke that contract, well, whose state has the authority to enforce the contract? Well, under the Articles of Confederation, there was no solution because only New York considered itself sovereign in New York, and only Massachusetts considered itself sovereign in Massachusetts. So there was no court to settle these disputes. Or let's say that you were convicted of a crime in one state and you ran away to another state, that state was not obligated to enforce your criminal conviction, send that person back, any of that kind of stuff. So the full faith and credit clause takes care of that. So if you are convicted of a crime in Texas and you run away to California, California will arrest you, pick you up, and send you back to Texas. If, say, you get a judicial decision against you, like let's say Texas orders you to pay child support, and you move to Montana, Montana is obligated to enforce that judicial decision. So this takes care of those problems that we had prior to the Constitution. So know for sure the Equal Protection Clause. That is probably one of the most important aspects of knowing about the Constitution. All right, so what are the advantages of having this system of government in place? One is we have a strong central government. Now, depending on your political point of view, that can be a pro or a con. But most people see this as a pro. Having a strong central government tends to protect people from abuses of power. Now, this current administration is a bit different than ones that we've had in the past. But the idea is that typically it would be the states that abuse their power, and the federal government would step in to regulate that. So for most of our history as a country, the federal government has protected citizens from the abuses of the states. Things like unfair taxation or denial of civil rights, things like that. The federal government maintains our military, so we are protected from threats around the world, and ensures that our currency is worth something. So those are all advantages to having a strong central government. Representation. So you as a citizen have representation at every level of government. You have city councilors and local officials, you have state reps and state senators and the governor and all of those. And then we have our US House of Representatives, we have the US Senate, all of those. So we are represented at every level of government. And if we are exercising our voice, we have a say-so. We vote to tell all of these people how we want things to be. So the more representation, the better, is pretty much the idea that our system is built on. Policy. No policy is one size fits all. So the states can experiment and see what works for each. So we know that the political culture of Texas is very different than the political culture of California. And so Texas can try something one way and California can try something a different way. And we'll see what works, what doesn't. Maybe parts of each policy works and parts don't. And we can take those ideas and implement them in other states to find solutions to problems. Now, when we're talking about Texas, trust in government is pretty low for the most part. Texans tend to trust their state government more than their state and local more than the federal government. Now, this was prior to COVID. I would be interested to see what these numbers look like today. But this is from 2015. So if you look at these numbers, dark blue is our favorable, light blue is our neutral, and then this kind of light red is unfavorable. So you can see that almost like about 57% of Texans had an unfavorable view of federal government. If you look at state government, we've got about 50% that have a favorable view, and then we're right about 47% with a favorable view of local government. So you can see that Texans tend to trust their government, the state and the local, more than they trust the federal government. Now, that's 2015. This is the year before Trump was elected, so President Obama was still in office. These numbers probably look different today, but I've yet to find a chart with current numbers. But I would also be interested to see how COVID affected this, because like we have talked about, Governor Abbott's favorability has suffered because of COVID. So I'd be interested to see what this looks like. Unfortunately, with data, it always lags a bit behind, so we probably won't know that for a couple of years. Now, one of the things that Texans do not like to admit is that we need the federal government. So each state has a budget, and their budget is made up of taxpayer money, and this is how we decide what we're going to spend on what programs, what we're going to fund, all that good stuff. This was our budget for the 2016-2017 budget cycle. You can see 48% of our budget comes from taxes raised within the state. 17% is other revenue, and this can be fees, fees, fines, all kinds of stuff like that. 2%, 2% is generated by the lottery. And then this big green part right here, 33% or 1/3 of our budget is money that is given to us by the federal government. Now, we had that talk about, some of y'all asked me, could Texas survive if we decided to become the Republic of Texas again? Well, the moment we did that, we would lose this entire green chunk of our budget. So we would have to make that up some other way. And the only way available to us to make up that money would be to increase taxes. And the citizens of Texas are not going to stand for that. So this is the biggest part of that question. Could we survive without the money that the federal government gives us? It's 1/3 of our budget for the year. So you think about 1/3 of the things that government pays for in this state would immediately go away. So I don't think that it's very feasible that we survive without federal government. So our state received $68 billion in funds from the federal government, making us the 30th highest, recipient of federal government funds. So could we make up that money? Yes, but it would require a large amount of increased taxes. And we did turn down additional funds because of the Affordable Care Act. Most of you were probably young and not paying attention, but in 2012, Texas rejected the Affordable Care Act, which would have, in exchange for expanding eligibility for the Medicaid program, the federal government would have given us more money to pay for that service, and it would have made citizens of our state eligible for subsidized health insurance through the marketplace. We were one of the states that did not agree, so we did not get any of the benefits of being part of the Affordable Care Act other than the mandates like no pre-existing conditions. You could stay on your parents' insurance until you were 28, I believe. So we got all of those because those were mandated, but the additional funds and the cheaper insurance, we didn't get those benefits because we didn't opt in. Texas also receives more disaster aid than any other state in the U.S. If just this year, we had Hurricane Laura that just hit. In a given year, we have usually it's turned into a couple of hurricanes every year, tornadoes, wildfires, things like that. So we have declared a disaster 231 times between 2001 and 2017, which in those situations we get disaster relief from the federal government. So we do receive more disaster aid than any other state, and we receive this on top of our government has a rainy day fund for emergencies, but we refuse to use it. We would rather take the money from the federal government than use our own money. So again, this shows a reliance on the federal government that many Texans do not like to acknowledge. All right, so there's a couple of different styles of federalism that we'll talk about. Dual federalism, which is sometimes called layer cake federalism. If you were to draw a cake and draw lines between the different layers, that would represent dual federalism. This would be You would have your local, state, and federal government would be each layer, and there would be a barrier between the three of them. And so they did not go into each other's affairs. They only handled the responsibilities that was given to each level of government. And so this is called dual federalism because it tends to just look at the state and the federal government, not local. And layer cake is kind of how it's illustrated. This was the type of federalism we had uh, through World War II, up until the end of World War II. Post World War II, we have cooperative federalism, and this is called marble cake. So if you've ever had one of those pound cakes that's like chocolate and vanilla swirled, that represents the government being intertwined with each other, the state and the federal, and they can't be pulled apart without damaging the whole thing. So that represents cooperative federalism. And this started with the New Deal. The Depression, FDR comes in with the New Deal, expands the size of government, and uses the money of the federal government to pull the states out of the Great Depression. Unfortunately, the states did not have the money or the power to solve the depression within their states. It was only the power of the federal government that pulled us out of the Great Depression, on top of World War II as well. And one of the biggest things that came out of the New Deal was this program called Grants and Aid. And that goes back to our budget, this money that we receive from the federal government. They're grants. And so there's a couple of types of grants that are used by the federal government, but the big two are categorical grants, where the states receive money to fund a specific thing, and in exchange for accepting that money, they have to agree to regulations put on it by the federal government. So this now gives the federal government a way to influence what happens in the state. So, like education. Each year, the states get a certain amount of money from the federal government for education. In exchange for accepting that money, the federal government gets to demand that they comply with certain rules and regulations. So now the states can't just do whatever they want if they are going to take this money. So it gives the federal government more influence and control. A good example here: if you've ever driven to Louisiana, Louisiana has some of the worst roads known to man. They're just terrible. And the reason being was because back in I believe it was the 70s, towards the end of the 70s, maybe in the beginning of the 80s, the federal government decided that we should raise the drinking age to 21. Louisiana, being Louisiana, they have New Orleans and Mardi Gras and all that. They didn't want, and gambling, they didn't want to raise their drinking age because it was too big a part of their economy, the kind of party economy that they have. And so they refused. And so since the federal government decided to tie this drinking age to receiving highway funds, highway grants to build roads and improve roads and things like that. So Louisiana held out for so long that their roads started to deteriorate because they didn't have the money to do it themselves. And so they eventually cave in and raise the drinking age to 21, but their roads are probably a good decade behind the rest of the country. And that's a tangible effect of not complying with the federal government, is they withheld those funds and the state suffered. Matching grants are when a state wants to do a certain project and they come up with part of the money and then they go to the federal government to pay the rest. So if you, like, say, need to build a new bridge or a new building or something like that. New federalism was kind of the conservative response to cooperative federalism. Conservatives did not like this involvement of the federal government in state affairs. So, starting with Richard Nixon and going through all the way through Ronald Reagan, um, they start this process called devolution to give some power back to the states. Conservatives always believe that the states should have more power to determine how to run their own government. And so they switched to a type of money called block grants. Block grants, the federal government just give the states large sums of money and they don't attach strings to it and say, here, you take this money and you can decide what it should be used for. Um, During this period, we saw lots of corruption, lots of uh, if you looked at like some of the cities in the 1970s and 1980s, they were not the best places to live. There was lots of poverty and rundown buildings. And this is when you hear like the inner city and it's referred to really negatively. It's because when the states took this money, there was no strings attached to it. So they pretty much got to do whatever they wanted to with it. And they didn't invest it in things that were good for the people. They invested it in things that would make the state more money. So they would shift it around, invest it in certain things, trying to make a profit, but they wouldn't invest it where people actually needed it. So if you look at pictures of cities like New York and LA and Dallas and places like this during the 70s and 80s, they're covered with smog. There's lots of collapsed buildings, lots of poverty in the inner city, and all of that is because the states were not investing the money where it should go. And so this kind of shows the negative effects of there not being any guidance on what to do with that money. Coercive federalism is the name that conservatives gave to cooperative federalism because they felt it basically the federal government was using the money to coerce them into doing things they didn't want to do. Um, Unfunded mandates are when the federal government requires compliance, but they don't give the states money to comply. One of the biggest ones was when the Americans with Disabilities Act passed. It required that all public buildings now have disability accommodations, but they did not give the states the money to make these changes, like putting in ramps or installing elevators and things like that. The states had to pay for that out of their own money, and they're never happy about unfunded mandates. Preemptions are when the government requires compliance, and provides money, but requires compliance with other regulations that may not be related to that issue. So, if I was going to give you money for, say, education, but I said to get this money you had to lower your CO2 emissions, those two things are not really related. And so sometimes federal government can overstep their authority by tying these things together that don't really relate to one another. Now, these are some of the conflicts that Texas has had with the federal government throughout our history. When we joined the United States in 1845, Texas claimed all of the land off its coast up to 10 miles from its shores. So this stretched 10 miles into the Gulf of Mexico. The Supreme Court had already made a ruling on this and ruled that states could only claim, I think it's 5 miles. The debate would not be settled until 1953. So this goes on well over 100 years, Texas claiming 10 miles, every other state getting 5. And then a bill is passed to restore this power to the state of Texas. So we're one of the few states that has this authority. We had disputes with the U.S. government over who controlled the Red River. Texans had already bought this land and claimed that they had ownership of parts of the Red River. They'd already paid taxes and things like that. This issue actually gets resolved by nature. Much of the land, is eroded away that people claim to own. And so it kind of resolves the problem before there were any kind of legal issues over it. Immigration is one that we still deal with today. Texas clashes with the federal government quite a bit. We have a lot of, and even within the state, a lot of our big cities like Dallas and Houston and San Antonio and Austin have declared themselves sanctuary cities. And if you don't know what this means, Immigration is the responsibility of federal government to enforce immigration law. But local law enforcement, if they pick up someone who is undocumented, they can take them to jail, run all of their information, find out that they're undocumented, and then contact ICE to come pick them up for deportation. Sanctuary cities have essentially declared that they will not do this. And there's different reasons why. But in a lot of sanctuary cities, they have large populations of Latinos. And so they don't want to make Latinos scared to call law enforcement if they actually truly need law enforcement. And so being a sanctuary city, they say, increases, kind of the cohesion in the community because undocumented citizens don't have to worry about whether they can contact law enforcement or all this kind of stuff as well without fear of deportation. The state of Texas has said that any city that declares itself a sanctuary city will lose funding from the state. So this is an ongoing dispute between the states and the cities. Now, the way the Constitution is written, local government does not have its authority is subservient to the state, just like the state, the federal government is supreme to the state. But we've seen increasing instances of the cities in the state of Texas pushing back against state government on issues like this, on law enforcement funding, all this stuff that's been happening this year. So it'll be interesting to see how some of this stuff plays out because the cities are starting to push back and saying that, well, if the state is going to withhold funding, then we just won't send them our tax revenue and we'll see what, if they can get by without that. So there's a lot of things at play here. Voter ID is a settled one, but there was a conflict over needing a specific type of ID to vote. And so in Texas, we passed a law in 2011 that only allowed you to use 5 types of ID to vote. State-issued ID, a driver's license, a military ID, a handgun license, or a passport. This was struck down by the Supreme Court in 2016 as being unconstitutional. The reason being is because to get any form of those IDs, you have to pay money, which they believed constituted a modern-day poll tax, because there are people out there who live on a fixed income who it is very tough to pay for something out of their budget. And so now you can vote with your voter registration card, which is free when you register to vote, and you can sign an affidavit swearing you are who you say you are if you do not have a picture ID. And then education we'll talk more about in our policy chapter. There's a lot of issues in education to talk about. And so that's it for our chapter on federalism. I'm sure y'all will have lots of questions over this one, so we'll talk about this in our Q&A this week.